Thank you for tuning in to this episode. Please note that all views and opinions expressed by both the guest and host do not necessarily reflect those of the college, DCYF, or the organization that they might represent. Thank you.
And this term was created regarding high achieving individuals that were marked by an inability to internalize their accomplishments, and they had a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. So even though these people were very competent, they still felt like they were a fraud. And so that's where this term imposter syndrome comes from.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Partnership Connections podcast. This podcast is centered around child welfare training and educational topics, all with the goal of helping to support those already working in or with an interest in working in child welfare. My name is Stan Brazier, and I'm the project director for the learning partnership between the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCYF, and Rhode Island College. Our desire is to bring information from experts on a variety of topics, all at no cost to hardworking professionals and others. Today, we'll be talking with our guests about integrating your cultural self into your work. Whether you are a clinician, child welfare caseworker, or anyone in the helping field, this could come up in various ways. When you Google keywords along today's topic, you'll find a lot about workplace culture, but not about how one's own culture and experiences might impact their place and purpose in the workforce. Our guest today is going to help us navigate some of what this all means. So joining us again today is Jennifer Gaviria. Jennifer is an adjunct faculty at Rhode Island College. She's also the co-founder of the Latino Mental Health Network of Rhode Island. The mission of the Latino Mental Health Network is to recruit and retain aspiring and current Latinx or multilingual mental health providers by providing support and professional development. Jennifer, good to see you again and welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Good to see you too. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. We always appreciate when folks take time out of their busy schedules. So, like I was mentioning in the intro, you find a lot about like quote unquote workplace culture, right? But we maybe don't often think about like how our own personal cultures impact our careers, our relation to colleagues. So how does like the self-awareness of our own cultural values, beliefs, norms impact our careers, our career choices, and our relations to colleagues and even some of the families that we work with?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, I think it's from my own experience that is what brought me to this topic and kind of creating CUs around it. Because, for example, in my culture, I'm Latina, my family's from Colombia. I was born here, but my parents are both from Colombia. And in my culture, in my family, you have to be very respectful to your elders, right? But also just in general, making sure that you are always very polite. And so as a social worker, you're trained to ask these questions that can be very intrusive. And I felt very kind of weird about that because I'm like, okay, how can I do this? How can I ask these questions about very intimate things to people? It feels very unpolite. So that's just an example of how our own cultures and values can impact our work. And we need to be self-aware of where that's coming from, right? I think maybe in the beginning, I didn't really understand why am I so uncomfortable asking these questions? But then in supervision, talking with my supervisor, we were able to unpack that and realize, oh, it's because of how I was brought up. So there is a lot in the workplace that happens that there's sometimes these different norms, right? Especially in the American work culture that people from different backgrounds might not have grown up with, right? Especially if you're first generation, maybe you don't have parents that were kind of in white collar jobs, right? Maybe it was blue collar jobs. So all of that we bring to the workplace, right? And there really isn't like a book to show you what to do in certain scenarios, right? Usually you learn it from home or you're able to kind of talk to your parents or people that you know about certain things at work. But some of us don't have that, right? And there also might be a language barrier, right? So sometimes even with my own parents, it's hard for me to explain like, well, what did I do at work? Because they're like, that's all you did, right? Especially if they had like physical labor. So those I think are some just examples of how our upbringing, our culture can impact what we bring and who we are to the workplace. And I think that some of those can be strengths, but I think we also have to be self-aware of how we react to different things in the workplace. Like I mentioned, my personal experience asking those intimate questions.
Right. I think that's a good example of you turned like something that was maybe a little bit of a barrier into a positive, into a strength. Are there other things that you've seen, whether within your own culture or others' cultures, just maybe from coworkers or anyone that you've interacted with, that has it's like a real clash between like their own culture and the American workplace culture, generally speaking, where it's been difficult for them to maybe wrap their head around things about how things work differently, or it just things are not in line with how things might be done, generally speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think even thinking about like being on time for work or what does that even mean, right? Like for some, in some cultures and in some organizations, being on time is being late. So you also have to like understand the nuances of the organization you work at, but also it could be like even the food that you bring to work, right? I've seen different conversations around that, right? Like what is appropriate lunch food, like, thinking about others and but what we bring to work. So I think it can there's such a continuum of different examples of how our identity, our cultural identity, and our upbringing impacts the workplace. So those are just like some little examples, but how we interact with our supervisor, right? If we're going to be very formal or informal, right? Depending on how we were brought up, what we were taught, how we interact with our clients as well. Again, are we going to be more informal, formal? Are we understanding the nuances of their culture too? Because they're bringing their own identities too. So it can get, a little complex there as well.
Right. Knowing, you're from Colombia, as you mentioned, and I think you seem to know a lot, obviously, about other Latinx cultures, or you do your research and you try to find out how do, again, broadly speaking, across like Latinx cultures, how might some of their own cultural values and beliefs affect the way they view like the child welfare system and interacting with other professionals within the system, or families that have to interact with professionals, and vice versa. Like how might some of those values come up, the values that they place maybe on cultural norms, family values, family structures, different attitudes and beliefs towards child rearing, things like that. How might that kind of show up?
Yeah, I mean, the first thought that I have is the respect, right? The respeto is something very common in the Latinx culture. And so if someone with authority is coming into our home, you are definitely trying to follow the rules and make sure that you're like not getting in trouble. Like it can feel like very scary. Obviously for all families, it can be very scary when DCYF is involved. But sometimes maybe people might not be as forthcoming because of that respect, or it might appear like they're not forthcoming. For example, they might be asked questions and they might be very agreeable. Or if there's a plan, they might say, yeah, yes, I'm going to be doing that because of the respect, but it doesn't necessarily mean they might follow through, and they might not understand the gravity of that.
Have you seen sort of the reverse, where it's sort of like the professional that's working with the family that might have some trepidation, or might be hesitant to ask even a family that they're working with certain questions because of respect issues, or just some of the values and cultural norms that they were brought up with?
I mean, I haven't seen that But I wouldn't be surprised that sometimes that could come up, like in my own experience, right? And if that person is not self-aware of why that's happening, then it's impacting their work. So, I think that that's something important for supervisors to be aware of, that it's not that this person is not trying to do their job, but that they are trying to be respectful of the family and how, and if they maybe haven't been trained in like trauma-informed care, or even if they are, I think, again, it can feel like maybe accusatory when you're asking these questions, right? So guiding them on how to ask them, I think, is important.
We have another episode that's talking about generational diversity, and we talk a lot about some of the new generation and there being, maybe some entitlement, but also like, assertiveness maybe is a more positive word, right? But one of the things that you talk about is that imposter syndrome and maybe some of that feeling of like not really belonging and maybe not really knowing how to assert oneself or feel like they can negotiate or feel like they belong. So can you talk to us a little bit about like what imposter syndrome looks like and what that really means?
Yes. So I will go into what imposter syndrome is, because some people might not know, or they might not have heard of it. So it was actually created in 1978 by clinical psychologists, Dr. Pauline R. Clance and Susan A. Imes. And this term was created regarding high-achieving individuals that were marked by an inability to internalize their accomplishments, and they had a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. So even though these people were very competent, they still felt like they were a fraud. And so that's where this term imposter syndrome comes from. So, in popular culture, it kind of has developed, and it's utilized when someone is usually, if it could be at work, but it can also be like playing a sport or something like that, where the person is doing their job, but they feel like they're not good enough. Like they are going to, their supervisor's going to find out that they're really not good at their job and they're going to be fired. And this is, I think it's very common. I was a supervisor for a very long time of different interns. And I think it's very common for newer clinicians to experience this. It doesn't have to be, someone from a different background. But what we have seen is that people from diverse backgrounds, especially when their work environment lacks diversity, they tend to have this feeling of imposter syndrome as exacerbated. So a lot of times, if you don't see someone that looks like you, that is doing the job that you are doing, sometimes the thoughts are like, was I chosen because of my background? Am I really not competent enough? And I'm a diversity hire, that type of thing. So that's where the cultural piece kind of comes in with imposter syndrome.
So what are some tools that one could use to kind of combat imposter syndrome? And is imposter syndrome maybe more or less prevalent in certain cultures?
So what I have read is that in different diverse groups or people from underrepresented backgrounds tend to have it more, but there isn't like one specific group. It just is saying like people from diverse groups. But in the workplace, the workplace can also help combat the imposter syndrome by being more inclusive, right? So, making sure that there are inclusive hiring practices, right? Because if someone feels like they're the diversity hire, I think they'll be less likely to feel that way if the process of the interview and the onboarding is inclusive, right? And more intentional. I think that if the workplace is also celebrating diversity and, offering a professional development, I think is really important too, especially, for newer clinicians or people that are new into that field. Supervision is going to be very important as well, to be able to tell that person, it's okay. Like we've all been there. And then for the person themselves that's experiencing that, I think a lot of it, sometimes it's about confidence, it's about self-awareness, understanding, that it is happening, that they are competent. It's just that you're having these negative thoughts. Sometimes it's a little bit of positive self-talk, right? That can help you. But if you're not in an inclusive environment, the positive self-talk is not going to work.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned the supervisor-supervisee relationship. Like, what are some other things that a supervisor could do? Sort of, right. It kind of sounds like you want to set the tone from the outset, right, with somebody that might be a little bit newer or maybe less familiar with the work environment, the work culture, come from a different culture than your own. What sort of questions might a supervisor want to ask or kind of get to know about that person? Because they don't want, I am a person that's like, I kind of want to not overshare. I'm happy to share some personal details, maybe about my own, culture or family or whatever, and that kind of thing. And other, there's a continuum, right? So, like, how does a supervisor maybe like to kind of tap into their supervisees? How culture might impact their work, or is that become too intrusive? Because it could be really impacting their work, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that being curious, and not like accusatory is important as a supervisor, and respecting people's boundaries, of course, because some people don't want to share. And as a supervisor, you can say, you don't have to share with me. I'm just noticing this. And,
Right.
Because we're helping them become self-aware. It's not necessarily that we have to like delve deeply, with the supervisee, but we can explore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And help them explore about, what they may be feeling. But we do have to be careful, especially if, because there is a power dynamic, what our background is, what's their background, and talking about it, right? Like, how do you feel working with me as a Latina, right? Do you think that could impact our relationship in any way? We have to be the one to bring it up. The supervisor has to bring it up. The supervising is not going to bring it up. There is a power dynamic, and it's just, they might feel like they might get fired for bringing it up. So
Right. And I think on the other end of the spectrum, for the supervisor, it's definitely seems like it could be a slippery slope because you don't want to ask the wrong question or ask a question that becomes overly intrusive. But like you said, maybe something I'm noticing certain things within your work. Do you mind sharing about like, I think you don't necessarily have to ask coach, but it might come out naturally in a conversation about like, where do you think that comes from? Or what do you think the root of that is? As you mentioned, like your example at the outset, like, why do you think you're having this hesitancy about asking these certain questions or whatever the case might be, right? Like, and that could maybe just organically come out as like, well, I was raised in this culture or was raised with these certain values. And that's, maybe that's why I'm having this, this issue where I'm experiencing imposter syndrome or experiencing these barriers. So what else in your mind, kind of helps everyone from administration, supervisors, managers to frontline workers, encouraging them to have like a more inclusive, what else kind of helps foster a more inclusive workplace and like, the sharing of cultural values and beliefs and the celebration of that. And again, like not like pressuring anyone into sharing anything, but like what helps make things and culture, I think in very broad terms too, right? It doesn't have to be like, oh, I'm, this ethnicity or whatever background, but just like, where I was raised geographically within the United States or within a certain culture, they have their own kind of way of doing things or accents or things like that and stuff like nomenclature. So what makes kind of what helps make a more inclusive workplace?
yeah, I think, it's something that we always have to be constantly working on, right? And, it doesn't have to be necessarily just about culture, but like about how are we going to be more welcoming to people, right? So that people feel safe, right? and, making sure that we are thinking about implicit bias, having discussions about it, learning about it. ERG groups or employee resource groups can be very important for people to feel connected to others that might have similar experiences. And, as supervisors, as leaders, we should be the ones leading the conversation about the topic, because people that are in entry-level positions are not going to bring it up. So it really is about the leadership, right? And again, just creating psychological safety so that people can give feedback, and that there are feedback channels that allow staff to provide that feedback and express their concerns without, feeling like there's going to be some retaliation, right? Because we're always learning, we're going to make mistakes. So what are those systems going to be?
Right. Yeah. No, I like the word welcoming too, because again, I think it implies that it's got to be right from the outset. I think a lot of this kind of gets lost in the shuffle when you get in the weeds when you start working, and now like you're 6 months down the line, a year down the line, and you realize that you feel lost at a certain workplace, or you feel like you don't belong, or you don't feel included, when that could have been, right from the get-go, things could have been a lot more, as you mentioned, like welcoming, right? So,
yeah. And I'll add, so I think also a good onboarding and feedback loops, like at the 3-month of a new employee, 6-month, 12-month, right? We're going to be checking in on how they're doing.
okay.
Because a lot of times, we onboard them and we never talk to them again until they go on FMLA. And I'm kind of talking about like HR, or we, are never really involved again. So I think those are some good practices.
Right. Yeah. Continuous check-ins and ongoing, support. Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts? Any other things you want to mention on this topic?
I think that, it's easier said than done. It is something that, can be challenging, but it's important because it's very common. A lot of people have imposter syndrome. And there was some research that I pulled up that about 70% of professionals will experience some form of imposter syndrome. So I think that it's important for us to, make sure that we are getting that feedback, right? And some of it, this imposter syndrome could be related to people's, cultural identity and how welcomed they feel within the organization, right? And how, if they feel isolated or included. So I think that, if we worked a little bit more on this, maybe our attentions would be better. I think it also impacts productivity. So just thinking about all of those things and how, prevalent it is important. And I think people don't talk about it enough.
I think there's a lot of that goes into just learning each other's work styles and how we want to work and interact and engage with colleagues and the people that we're serving in the workplace, and what I mentioned right at the top, like there's a lot on workplace culture. So how do we integrate ourselves into workplace culture? Do we want to be integrated that much into workplace culture, or do we want to be able to have more boundaries, like we mentioned? What does a positive workplace culture look like? And that is more than just like understanding our own culture, but like each other's personalities, kind of what are, some people's triggers might be, like, understanding more about each other just in a holistic sense, not just culture, right? Just to kind of know how people work and to just better support them, right? Because you mentioned retention. If people don't feel supported, or you don't get that supervision and they don't get that support where they do have a supervisor that's well-meaning and supportive and trying to help them figure out issues or barriers or challenges, then chances are they might not stay very long, right? So
Exactly.
Jennifer, great talking to you again. Thank you so much for doing this, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.